Hello chess friends! In this video chess lesson, I will give you some basic introduction to one of the most popular black's responses to e4 move, which is French defense. Usually, French defense starts with e4, e6, d4, and then d5 move. And in French defense, black will in general let white to have more space in the center in exchange for a solid position and chances for counterattack later in the game. And if white, for example, plays e5 in this position, and that is the move which will happen in many variations, the center is closed, we have two competing pawn chains, and each player will now try to outflank the other. In the game, black will usually try to play some freeing moves like c5 and f6, and there is another very important characteristic of this French defense, which is in general bad light square bishop on c8 square. Black will try somehow to develop that bishop. Usually black has problems with that bishop, and the plan to develop it maybe with playing bishop d7, bishop b5, or b6 and bishop a6. But before we discuss about some main lines and a little bit of theory of French defense, let's see some possible early deviations. In the second move, white can play, for example, b3, and it can be sometimes played as a gambit after d5 to play bishop b2, with sacrificing the pawn on e4. Another option for white is to play d3, and that will lead to a sort of King's Indian defense with the colors reversed. Another early deviation in the second move for white is queen e2, but sometimes is also played knight f3, and this variation is so-called knight f3, knight c3 variation, where after d5, knight c3, black can play d4, white plays knight e2, and now it is wrong to play d3, because after knight f4, dc2 and queen c2, white definitely will have better development in this position. That is why after knight e2 the best move for black is c5, and this position is considered as a very good position for black. So let's get back now to the main variation after d4, d5 move. And whichever variation of French defense is played here, there are certain themes which tend to occur in French defense. Like, for example, a pawn formation, which will occur in several main variations, where neither d nor e pawn are exchanged. As I have said, black has more space on the queen side, and that is why black will try to develop his play on the queen side of the board, while on the other side, white has more chances to attack on the king side. After second move for black d5, now white has to decide what to play here. There are several continuations, and four main moves which we can see in French defense are e takes d5, e5, knight d2, and knight c3. So let's see now first exchange variation, e takes d5, e takes d5. The exchange variation has the reputation of being very safe for white. We have very symmetrical pawn structure, there is no any imbalance in the game at the moment, and this open e-file will encourage both sides to trade major pieces along this file. White will probably maintain some nominal advantage because he moves first, but draws are very common in this line. And there is a general thought about this variation that if white seriously wants to win the game, then he must choose a different move and different variation than exchange variation. Possible continuation now might be knight f3, bishop d6, bishop d3, knight f6, knight e5, short castle, c5, c3, and so on. Another move, third move for white, is e5. e5 is the advanced variation, and actually, according to Aaron Nimzowitsch, this was the best continuation for white, third move e5. But this move is nowadays less popular than knight c3, knight d2, or some other moves. So the game usually continues with c5 for black, then c3, knight c6, knight f3. And now the main move for black here is queen to b6, although bishop to d7 is also a possible move. If black plays now queen b6 move, now there is a very nice trap in which many beginners can fall into. And that is if white plays bishop to d3 now. And now we see that black attacks this d4 pawn 3 times, while white is defending this pawn only 2 times. But after cd4, it is very wrong to capture this pawn, knight d4. It may look like as a winning of a pawn, but after bishop b5 check, black will lose the whole queen. That is why, instead of capturing the pawn at the move number 7, here black should simply play bishop d7 at this moment, and now after bishop d7, then white plays short castle, knight d4, queen d4, knight c3. White is forced to enter in this gambit, in which he sacrifices one pawn, and also potentially the second pawn if now black wants to capture the pawn on e5. So black will be 2 pawns up, and this gambit is called Milner-Berry gambit. But if black captures this second pawn, white has decent compensation after queen takes e5. So instead of playing this sixth move bishop d3, alternatives which will not lead to the gambit are bishop e2 and a3. So bishop e2 and a3 are possible moves for white. That will be all about advanced variation. Now we have third possible move is knight to d2. Knight to d2 is Tarrasch variation, and it is named after Siegbert Tarrasch. This move was actually very popular during the late 70s and early 80s, when Anatoly Karpov played this move a lot, and he had a very good result playing knight d2. It is still nowadays played by players who want to seek small but safe advantage. The main difference between knight d2 and the main move knight c3 is because this variation will not allow black to play third move bishop b4, because if this happens, then white will simply play c3. So bishop b4 is not possible to be played in knight d2 variation. Now the question is, how can black continue after knight d2? One variation is knight f6, and after e5, knight fd7 and f4, in which position we have some typical French positions. After f4, c5, c3, knight c6, knight from d to f3, queen b6, knight e2. Later white will play g3, bishop g2, and castle short side. Very interesting, and we can say a fashionable move among some top grandmasters in the move number 3, instead of this knight f6 move, is bishop e7 move. So this is maybe an odd looking move, but the aim of this move is to prove that now whatever white plays is somehow has drawbacks. For example, if white plays knight from g to f3, and after knight f6, e5, knight fd7, it's impossible to play f4, because later when black plays c5, white needs somehow to defend his pawn chain. If instead of knight from g to f3, in the move number 4, white plays bishop d3, c5, dc5, and now knight f6, very interesting move. Or if after bishop e7, white plays immediately e5, we have c5, queen g4, and king f8, very interesting move, which will lead to a different complications. And definitely the main move in Tarrasch variation after knight d2 is c5. And after ed5, we have seen many games in the chess history in which Karpov played as white and Korchnoi played as black. And this will definitely lead to the position in which black has an isolated queen pawn. We know that isolated queen pawn has some advantages and some disadvantages as well, but we will talk about that in some of the next lessons. And the usual continuation now may be knight gf3, knight c6, bishop b5, bishop d6, and now white captures the pawn on c5 because black already spent one move playing bishop to d6. So after dc5, bishop c5, castle, knight g7, knight b3, bishop d6, rook e1, and let's say short castle. There are many games in theory played like this. Interesting is that in this main variation after c5 ed5, it's possible also for black to capture queen d5, which will lose some time with his queen, but that will preserve a solid pawn structure, and there will be no isolated queen pawn. So for the players who are afraid to play with ITOP, they should probably take queen d5 in this position. And now we go to the main variation of French defense, which is that after d5, white plays third move, knight to c3. Now there are three choices, three possible main moves for black now. We have knight f6, which is classical variation, d4, which is Rubinstein variation, and bishop b4, which is Wienaber variation. Let's start with de4. This move is actually named after Akiba Rubinstein, and it is actually somehow passive position, but not necessarily bad. After knight takes e4, knight d7, knight f3, knight gf6. Now white has option to capture the knight on f6 or to play bishop g5. If, for example, bishop g5, pinning the knight to the queen, we have bishop e7, knight takes f6, knight takes f6, bishop d3, castle, queen e2, and important move c5. dc5, queen a5 check, c3, queen takes c5, and short castle, which is quite normal position for both sides. Black will just need to finish his development to develop his light squared bishop, and white will hope to do something later in the game using his queenside pawn majority. Or at this moment, instead of bishop g5, white can play immediately knight captures f6, and after knight f6, bishop d3, c5 again, dc5, bishop c5, both sides castles, bishop g5, and now b6 with a faster development of black's pieces, queen e2, bishop b7, rook from a to d1. Now black's queen is forced to move somewhere because there is a threat of bishop h7, discover check and winning the queen, and the question is where to go, queen e7 or queen c7. Maybe you will think that queen e7 is better move because it will preserve good pawn structure, but actually if queen e7 is played, there is knight e5, and after, let's say, rook from f to d8, knight g4. And in this position there is some small advantage for white. That is why better move after rook from a to d1 is queen to c7, and after bishop f6, black will a little bit destroy his pawn structure around the king, but the compensation is that he has a bishop pair, and this position is considered to be okay for black. Now white can trade the bishop pair, bishop e4, rook d8, bishop b7, queen b7, and position is completely playable for both sides. So that is all about Rubinstein variation. After knight c3, third move, we said that another possible move is Wienaber variation. Wienaber variation starts with bishop to b4. This variation is named after Simon Wienaber, and this is one of the main systems in French defense. It was very often seen sometimes in the middle of 20th century, but maybe sometimes around 1980s, the classical variation with knight f6 was started to play much more than this bishop b4. So the point of this move is that it will pin the knight on c3, which is defending the pawn on e4, and it's possible to play some Alekhine gambit, for example playing knight from g to e2 and sacrifice the pawn on e4. Other moves which can sacrifice the pawn on e4 are also bishop d2 or a3. But the main variation is not to sacrifice the pawn. The main variation is to play e5. And now, after c5, which is next move, a3, bishop c3, bc3. Obviously, in this position, like in general in most of the French defense positions, white has more space on the king side, where now black is even weaker because he doesn't have any more dark squared bishop. That piece is already traded. And white very often plays queen g4 and puts some pressure to this g7 pawn. Black will search for his compensation, usually in a bad pawn structure which white has, and in a certainly weakened queen side. So possible continuation here will be knight e7, queen g4, queen c7, and now white wins two black's pawns on the king side, g7 and h7, but position is very complicated and not clear. After cd4, now c3 pawn is under attack, and white's rook on a1 may be in danger. So white can play knight e2 to defend that c3 square, and after development move knight c6, f4 to defend simply the pawn on e5, and after bishop d7, queen completed the task on the king side and goes back to d3. dc3, knight c3, a6, let's say rook b1, and this position is complicated. No matter that at this moment white is a pawn up, black also has his chances in this variation. And finally, we go to the classical variation of French defense with the third move knight f6, which is actually nowadays a major system in French. And now white can continue with e5 and play this Steinitz variation, or he can play bishop g5. If e5, usual continuation is knight from f to d7, then f4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop e3, a6, queen d2, b5. And we see again the main characteristics of French defense for black. His light squared bishop, which is in general bad piece, and in this pawn structure, when the center is closed, it is not easy to develop that bishop and to make it active. Whichever tradings now happen on d4 square, this bishop still remains as a passive piece. Other possible move after knight f6 is bishop g5. Practically it threatens now e5 to attack this pinned knight. So after bishop g5, we see now possible continuation like d takes e4, which is very usual reply nowadays. D takes e4, which is called Bern variation. It's named after Amos Bern. And this can become quite imbalanced position if after knight e4, bishop e7, bishop f6, black recaptures g takes f6. But of course that black can recapture bishop f6 in this position, which is quite slower and not that much aggressive variation, with not such a big imbalance like with g takes f6 line. The main move after bishop g5 is bishop to e7, and after e5, knight from f to d7. Now the main variation for white is to capture the bishop on e7, but an alternative for white is so-called Albin-Chattard attack, and it is not very popular on grandmaster level, but we see that variation more in amateur games. The point is to play h4 move to sacrifice the pawn. Black is not forced now to accept this offer and to win the pawn by capturing twice on g5. He can play some of these moves like f6, a6, or short castle. But if he accepts the pawn, bishop g5, a g5, queen g5, knight h3, we see that white has sacrificed the pawn in order to improve his attacking chances on the king side. And this semi-open h file gives white another line to attack, and he will also gain some time because now black's queen must retreat and so on. But the main variation, as we said in this position, is to capture the bishop on e7. After queen e7, f4, short castle, knight f3, and c5. And now, in this position now, white has a number of options, including bishop d3, queen d2, or d takes c5. That would be all for this lesson, in which I made introduction to French defense to you. If you want to see some specific content in my video chess lessons, please place the comment below my video on YouTube. Take a look at the suggested videos and don't forget to like, share and subscribe to my channel.